Morning, everybody. I think I know most of you, but for those of you who I don't know, I'm Lee Pachter. As Erin said, I am at Christianacare. I was at Nemours prior to that. I'm a pediatrician. But what I'm going to talk to you today about is a side job that I have as an editor of an academic journal. And I thought what I would do is just very informally talk about some of what I call the soft skills about submitting papers. I mean, we all know that we want to have our research be the best it can and written up the best. And I'm going to assume that the research project that you're submitting is high quality, scientifically sound and everything like that. So we'll take that as a given. So what are the other things that you need to think about as you submit to a journal? And I'm going to give you kind of like a view from the editors and the reviewers' perspective. Think of this as like a different culture. I have a few slides. Let me try to share my screen. So I've actually been an editor for almost 25, 26 years. And again, I'm the editor of the Journal of Developmental Behavioral Peds. If you're not a pediatrician, if you're not interested in developmental behavior, I'm not going to talk anything specifically about my journal, but just the publishing and the editorial process in and of itself. I was an associate editor for 16 years, and I'm just starting my second 6-year term as editor-in-chief. So what I thought I would talk about is, first of all, give you the process of submission, not from your perspective as a researcher who's submitting the paper, but what happens once you click, submit, what happens to your paper? Because you're probably wondering, why does it take so damn long for people to make a decision? I'm going to let you know a little bit about what that process is. But then I want to talk about, as I said, some of the soft skills, things that you probably don't learn in your stats course or your research design course, things like how to decide where to submit your work, what journal. And some of the things that, although they're not going to make or break whether a journal accepts or rejects your paper, it helps. It really helps because we all know that there's a psychology behind it. There's no such thing as objectivity. You're dealing with reviewers and you're dealing with editors who are people, and they like to have things go as smoothly as possible. So I'm going to try to give you some things that will make it as easy as possible for a journal to accept your good work. Okay. So first, what happens to my paper once I click submit? Typically it takes anywhere from 6 weeks to 3 or 4 months to get a decision on a paper. And it seems like it's an inordinate amount of time. But what happens is, once you submit your paper, it goes through a number of processes. The first thing is before it reaches any kind of scientific editor or content expert, it goes through the editorial team, like an editorial manager who checks your paper to make sure that it conforms to the journal's guidelines. So that's like the first thing. I mean, if you want things to go as smoothly as quickly as possible, make sure that you're using the guidelines so it doesn't get kicked back to you because of references or something like that. Once it's in good shape, then it goes to one of the editorial team, and different journals do it differently. At our journal, it goes to me as the editor-in-chief. I read the paper, I decide whether it's a good fit with our journal or not, and whether it should go out for external peer review. So there's really two processes. The first process is going through internal editorial review, where the internal team decides whether the paper is a good fit and has a likelihood of possibly being accepted. And then it goes out to the peer reviewers, the external peer reviewers. Typically when you submit a paper, you should be getting anywhere from 1 to 3 reviews. We usually like to get at least 2, hopefully 3. Just so you know, for a journal, most reviewers say, no, I don't have time, and no, I can't review the paper. So for me to get 2 reviews back to you, I typically have to invite anywhere from 3 to 6 reviewers. And that takes time. We send them out an email. It usually sits in their email box for about 5 days. They look at the abstract. They decide whether they can do it or whether it's their area of interest. If they say no, then I have to go, or the software automatically spits out the next reviewer, and then that whole process starts. So although we ask reviewers to get their reviews in within 21 days, three weeks of accepting it, we have to wait for at least 2, if not 3 reviewers. So if reviewer 1 gets in really quickly, but we're still waiting on reviewers 2 and reviewers 3, that's why it takes so long sometimes to get a decision. And then it goes back to the editorial team who reviews the reviewer's comments and then makes a decision. So it's a pretty simple but long process. It could be long. Sometimes it goes really well. Our journal The number of days to first decision is usually around 30 days. No, I'm sorry, 60 days, which is 2 months, which is actually pretty good compared to some papers, some journals. I've waited 6 months for initial decision at some journals. So that's that. So I guess from your perspective, the first thing you have to think about is what's the best journal for me to submit my work to? And that sounds like it's pretty simple, but it isn't. And I tend to think of this as a goodness of fit issue. You want to make sure that your paper, number one, is distributed to the best audience for that paper. But even before that, for it to be, before it's accepted, you have to just make sure that all the ducks are in a row, that the journal is the best place to review your paper. So first and foremost, obviously, audience. So if you're a clinician and your work is clinical research, you want to make sure that the audience of that journal is both clinical and clinical research. If you're a bench researcher, obviously you're not going to go to a clinical journal because the readers don't read, bench research. So it sounds pretty simple, but audience is really important. And the one thing that I've noted, the one thing that I've said, which is a good way of looking at it, is look at your reference list in your paper. And those journals that you reference often are likely the journals that review your type of paper. So one good kind of like test of am I submitting it to the right journal is have you referenced that journal in your reference list, okay? I think that's really important. Everybody's worried about impact factor. I understand that's important. I understand that some institutions, for promotion, you need to publish in high impact factor journals. From my perspective, impact factor is highly overrated. I don't want to downplay it because I know that for some people it's really important, but impact factor is just such a small slice of a metric for a journal. So you probably know how impact factor is calculated, but basically the impact factor really is how many of a journal's papers have been cited by other researchers within the last 2 years. So think about that. If you have like a seminal paper, like the best paper in the world that was published 5 years ago and it gets referenced, thousands of times that year, it doesn't count to the impact factor. So the impact factor is a very, very small slice. It's a 5-year impact factor as well. And really, this is just citations. It's not about readability and how many people have read it, how many people have been affected by it. It's just whether other researchers use your research. So I think it's important, but don't overplay it. It's really not that important. And the other thing is that the number of the impact factor really depends on the type of journal that it is, whether it's a journal in an area which has a lot of different journals, or whether it's a very, very specific research area where there may be only 1 or 2 journals. So those journals are always referenced a lot. So again, there's a lot of magic and mystery around impact factor, which I think we should probably demystify. Fit with the journal and what they publish. And what I'm talking about here is types of papers. So, there are some journals who are, I'll give you an example of my journal. I mean, we obviously we publish things in the developmental behavioral pediatric realm. So clinical psychologists, developmental behavioral and general pediatricians, and educators usually submit to us. We don't publish purely psychometric papers. Now, a lot of the articles that we publish use instruments that are very, very common. And I typically get papers which redo the psychometric properties of such and such a questionnaire or such an instrument. It's our journal policy that we don't publish psychometric papers if they don't have any clinically relevant content. So you need to know that, because then if you submit a paper to me that's a beautiful paper with great psychometrics, as good as that paper is, it's not a good fit with my journal. So find out what the journal publishes and what they don't publish, okay? This is really important. You choose a publication because you want to know what the audience is, but also you want to make sure that that journal has reviewers that are aware of the topic of your research. And this sounds like it's a duh type thing, but it's not always the case. I mean, each journal has their own kind of cadre of reviewers. And there are many times where I get a relatively interesting paper, but I can't find a reviewer in my review cadre that's knowledgeable about that paper. So therefore, my reviewers may not be have the best insight into the research that you're doing. So in addition to audience, make sure that you think that the people who publish in that journal, which form part of the review panel, the future review panel, that they know the topic of your work. And then special considerations if you're resubmitting to another journal. So we all get rejected, and once we get rejected, we consider that to be free advice, and then we turn the paper around and we consider our second journal to submit to. I can't emphasize enough that if you get rejected, and if you get reviews that that form the basis of the rejection, before you resubmit it to another journal, address those reviewers' comments. Really important. There's just a small group of reviewers in your area, and it's very, very likely that the same reviewers that rejected your paper at Journal 1 may be considered as a reviewer for Journal 2. And I can't tell you how many times I request a review and then the reviewer emails me saying, I just reviewed this for Journal of Pediatrics and it was really bad, or, it had some substantial issues. So then the next question I ask of that reviewer is, take a look at the submission now, and did they address your concerns, or did they address the reviewer's concerns? If they say no, it's the same paper, I will not accept that paper, because if you as a researcher didn't take the initiative and didn't take the time to think about what the reviewer said and think of that as free advice and change your paper because of that, I don't think I want to, I don't want your paper. I could just as easily, find the old reviews from the other journal and send them back to you and say, it's the same. I'm not going to publish something that someone else rejected if you hadn't changed it or modified it. So, it's a small group of reviewers. We can tell if it's been rejected somewhere else. So I strongly encourage you to take the free advice of the reviewers and do a revision before you resubmit the paper. Okay, just for your consideration. Okay, another really important thing is read the journal's guidelines for authors. Every journal has different guidelines, things in terms of word count, structure of paper, what sections are allowed, reference style, number of tables and figures. I can easily tell if I'm a second submission, if my journal is a second submission, if I get a paper that's formatted for pediatrics. And I know that pediatrics has a different format than me. Again, just like the reviews, if you haven't taken the time to read the guidelines for authors for a particular journal before you submit it, shame on you. And editors and reviewers are savvy to this and are sensitive to this, okay? And I just think that's really important. It's not bad. I don't feel bad if I'm like second journal that you submit to. I want to show that you've made a commitment to my journal by doing the things that you should do before you submit it to me. Part of that has to do with the cover letter, which, it's something that you do like, the 30 minutes before you submit the paper. It's not that important, but it kind of is, because really that's the first thing that the editor reads. Maybe they'll read the abstract first, but then after the abstract, before they read the paper and decide whether to accept or not, they read your cover letter, and it could make or break you. And I'll tell you some of the reasons why. They're kind of funny. This is like a duh thing. Address the letter to the editor by name, okay? You don't know how many cover letters I get submitted that said, "Dear Editor," or "Dear Editorial Board." I think that's okay, but from a perspective of the journal, if you haven't taken the time to look on the web to see who the editor-in-chief is and address it by name, "Dear Dr. Jones," I figure your commitment to my journal isn't that great. You don't know much about my journal, so why would I want to publish your work? I can't tell you how many times this is funny. I get a cover letter that says, "Dear Dr. First." Now, I know that Louis First is the editor of the Journal of Pediatrics. So, duh, I just found out that you had submitted this to Pediatrics, it was rejected, and now you're recycling it to my journal. And that's okay, but at least, change the name from Dr. First to Dr. Pachter, right? So first thing, don't say "Dear Editor," do it by name, make sure it's the right name and it's spelled correctly. In your cover letter, don't replicate your abstract. Just provide 1 to 3 sentences about, what you did and the significance of the paper. and why it fits the journal that you're submitting to. That shows me that you've looked at my journal, you've looked at the papers that we publish, you looked at our instructions for authors, and you've made a commitment to our journal. So I will make a commitment to your paper, to reviewing your paper. There are always times where you may have to break the rules of the author's guidelines. So let's say, my journal, you're allowed 3,500 words. Well, like if you're 3,900 words, if that's the case, write that in the letter saying, I understand that your guidelines for authors say that manuscripts need to be 3,500 words or less. Given the blah, 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 we've gone over by 250 words, and I hope that you will consider it. And we'd be happy to discuss that for the future. Or, your reference you only allow 30 references. We needed to have 37. That shows me that you've read our guidelines and you've thought about it, and you're asking for an exemption. And that's fine. We typically give exemptions, okay? The question I also typically get is, should you recommend reviewers, potential reviewers, in your cover letter? And everybody's different on this. And I don't have like a yes or no answer to this. I guess the easiest thing I can say is that if the research you're doing is such a narrow scope of research where there are only a few reviewers, and the editorial team may not know that research that well, then it is helpful to recommend reviewers, both reviewers to review, and then if you think that there's anybody that has a conflict of interest, feel free to put that in as well. If it's a general paper where you know that the journal has dozens of reviewers who know that topic, it's probably not necessary to recommend reviewers. Okay, so those are just some basic guidelines. Okay, something that you don't think about a lot, but an editor thinks a lot about, is the reference list, for a few reasons. First of all, many journals limit the number of references. And the reason why is because, references take up space in the journal, and I want to publish as many good research articles as possible. And if I have a paper that has 150 references, it's going to take 3 or 4 pages, that limits me in the number of papers that I can publish, okay? So first of all, try to limit your references to only the ones that are really, really important. Also, I look to make sure in the reference list when those references were published. If you have like half of your references that published in the 1980s and the 1990s, you're not up to date on the research. Okay, so be as current as possible. You can reference older papers only if they're very seminal and if they're really, really important. The second thing I hate, especially when we have long reference lists, is like if you have a sentence there like, autism spectrum disorder is increasing in frequency, and then the footnote is 1 to 17, you don't need those 17 references, okay? So pare them down. That's one way that you can pare down references, by avoiding multiple references saying the same thing. Now this, I think, is the most important thing. Make sure that you, if possible, include pertinent references from the journal you're submitting to. Now you may not think about this, but think about it from the journal's perspective. When I look through the reference list and I see my journal referenced, it tells me a few things. It helps me in a few ways. First of all, it shows me that you know the literature and you know our journal and you've read the stuff and you've decided that our journal, fits with your content, number one. Number two, and again, this is something that not too many editors will admit to. When you reference my journal, and if we publish your paper, you're increasing my impact factor, because again, you're referencing my journal. Okay, and that gets included in the impact factor. Whenever possible, reference the journal's papers that are within the last 2 or 3 years, because remember, the impact factor just has that 2-year window. So, I've actually had reviewers tell me, savvy reviewers tell me, I think that this paper was not initially submitted to you because none of the references have JDBP in it. Okay, so I think that's important. Again, these are things you probably don't think about, and it's not going to make or break whether a journal accepts your paper or not, but it just gives the milieu of the editor really in thinking that your stuff is central to the content of my journal. Okay, last thing I'm going to say. You submitted it, it went through peer review, you got an accept with revisions or reject and reconsider after major revisions. That's good. So even if you get a letter that says we cannot accept your paper, however, we're interested in the topic and would consider re-reviewing a substantially revised paper. A lot of people get really depressed about that. think of that as something actually really good, okay? Because think of it in terms of resources. A journal doesn't want to cut bait in a paper that they know they're not going to accept. So they'll just reject it. If they say, we're willing to re-review, they are committing future resources to your work. Okay. Now it may or may not be accepted, but at least you've hit that bar that they're interested. Okay. We've agreed to spend more time and more resources on your paper. So your job at this point now is to make it as easy as possible for the editorial team to accept your paper, because they've made that commitment. You want to make it as easy as possible for them to check the boxes on the revision. Okay. You have to remember that being an editor and being a reviewer is a side hustle for most of us. This isn't our day job. We do this like on our evening times, and we steal time from our work, and we do it on weekends. We want to be able to make a decision as quickly as possible. And if I have to go through a revision line by line, word for word, to make sure that you've addressed all the reviewer's concerns, it kind of makes me grumpy. And although we hope that people will be objective and make decisions based on the content, you have to think about the psychological milieu you're asking the editors and the journal and the reviewers to work in. So make it as easy as possible for the editor to go, yep, did this, yep, did this, yep, did this, accept it. Okay? So how do you do that? You clearly document all the changes you made in the revision. Most journals require you to have like a letter addressing the response to reviewers. Our journal actually has like a form where you have to, like, each line is like a reviewer's comment. So you put the comment, you put down how you addressed it, and then you put down exactly page and line number where you addressed it. So that reviewer and that editor can go, okay, this is reviewer 1 comment A. They decided to agree with that, and they made the modification on page 3, line 14. So I go to page 3, line 14, I look at it, I check it off. If I have to go through your whole paper to try to find where you made the reviews, again, it takes time and it makes me grumpy. Make sense? Now, you could disagree with some of the reviewers' comments, and that's fine. But when you do it, create a really good justification for it so that the editor can say, okay, I mean, there are differences of opinions. I kind of accept that. Okay? Don't just say, just don't make believe it wasn't said, and don't address it at all. And I wouldn't do it too often. I mean, I think you, as an author, you probably should address most of the comments that reviewers make, but you are allowed to disagree. And this is the other thing. That document that is the response to reviewers is really important. But in addition to putting your response to reviewers in that document, you also have to change the paper. So a lot of times, they'll say, we agree with the reviewer, but however, blah, 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 blah. And our data, we didn't have that data, so we can't include it. That's fine. But then put that in as a limitation of the paper. Anything that you put in the response to reviewers letter should be reflected in the paper itself, because the readers aren't going to see the response to reviewers letter. They're just going to see the paper. Okay. So again, these are like kind of simple things, but in the rush to submit something, you may not think about all these things. So just the final thoughts. Number one, first and foremost, pick the right journal. Number two, consider reviewers' comments as free advice, and don't disregard them, even if you're not resubmitting to the same journal. If you're submitting to another journal, it's likely that we might pick the same reviewer who may know the work. Show that you've done your homework about the journal, follow the directions, the instructions for authors, customize the cover letter, and if possible, include references from that journal if appropriate. And first and most important, if you're not sure that your paper fits a specific journal, you should really think about emailing the editor before you submit, saying, I have this research paper, it's about this, I think it fits your journal, but I'm wondering if you would take a look at my abstract and let me know if it's a good fit with your journal. Journal editors love that. It's a little bit extra work in the front end, but it also, I mean, there are times where I say, yeah, this is great. We'd love for you to submit. Feel free to submit. But there's sometimes I'm saying, this is a really good paper, but it's not the best fit with my journal. You might want to consider this. So it saves you a lot of time because it's very unlikely that we will accept it, so you don't have to submit it to us. And if the editor says, yes, this fits our journal, so then you feel a little bit more confident that you're not wasting your time. So I'm going to stop sharing. I could I could further talk about a lot of these issues, and even other issues. Maybe if people are interested at another point, we can do that. But are there any questions or comments about what I said?